Hi, and welcome to VIBEZ Daily. This is a daily devotional curated by VIBEZ Church to help you practice the way of Jesus and be all that God has called you to be. You have joined us for our year-long series titled Devoted. Acts 2:42 tells us that the followers of Jesus were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. This podcast was created to provide context and commentary for what you read each day. Just before our friends begin discussing today's reading, we want to invite you not only for fellowship, but for prayer as well. We have created the VIBE Daily Chat Group to offer you fellowship and a community where you can state your observations, ask questions about the reading or the podcast. You can join us by downloading the VIBEZ Church app in your favorite app store. Click Join the Conversation and join us today. And finally, we hope that you can join us for prayer. Prayer happens Monday through Friday, and more information on that can be found on the VIBEZ Church app under prayer. Now, let's begin our conversation on today's reading.
All right, welcome back to the VIBEZ Daily podcast. This is day 37 of the Devoted Reading Series. We are in the book of Leviticus this week, and I am glad to be back and joined by my wife, Victoria, my friend Shameeka, and we are here to continue our journey through Leviticus. So this week is all dedicated to Leviticus, and we will finish it by the time this week is done. But we left off at chapter 6 yesterday. It was kind of our last reading. We are reading 7 through 11 today, and left off really as they started to get instructions about the priest responsibility in kind of the offerings and the sacrifices and a lot of what the priests had to do. So as we pick up here in chapter 7, which kind of continues some of those offerings that we left off yesterday, anything that was interesting to you guys about just the role of the priest in these offerings?
Well, one, like, I know you mentioned it, Victoria, just like how God was making it plain for them on, like, you know, what to do with the offerings, like how to do it, those kind of things. And like this weight that comes from like, hey, it needs to be done and it needs to be done a certain way and it needs to be done right. Was something that came up. But I do like how one specifically, just in pertaining to the offerings in general, I noticed this at the end of chapter 6, and now we're coming into chapter 7, that the sin offering and the guilt offering were considered the most holy.
Yes.
And I was like, what does that mean? Like, for these two out of all of them to be the most holy. And maybe it was because it is the two that are required, of that the Lord presented to the people, that isn't just like, you know, if you want to, if you feel led to, like, a gift to him. Like, he set those two apart as being like the most holy offerings. And with that came the different regulations into which he wanted the priest to carry them out. So
yeah, I noticed the same thing, that it was most holy and it must be eaten in the holy place. And so I was like, oh, these ones are different. And like you said, maybe because there's some weight that has to do with it, like the atonement of sin and all of that. And like this piece of meat, it really symbolizes the body of the person who sinned, right? Like, but yeah, I thought that was interesting. And that we start going into like this this sacrifice of peace offerings. This was called like a Thanksgiving offering. In verse 11 through like 18ish or so, we're like, this is the one that I see is like, it must be eaten on the same day. Right? Or like, you know, the same day and the next day, but don't eat it on the third day, just burn it up. And so I think I see, I don't know, it just looks like layers to me. Right? Like he first gave the instructions to the people, and I was giving instructions to the priest, and like there's just more rules and layers to go on it, to like I actually had to make myself a chart.
Come on, chart.
I'm sorry, y'all.
No, I love it. That's what
I had to make a chart to keep track of which ones needed what and who was doing what. And so I have a little chart that I made for each type of offering, because I found that like I would get a set of instructions for all of them, and then it would start over. I get another set of instructions for all of them, and then there's another like something different, you know, that he would speak on. So it did look like a 7-layer chocolate cake over here or something.
That's hilarious.
I love that.
Sounds great. No, I think that's good. And I think I appreciate you guys bringing out kind of the holiness factor.
Yeah.
And I think there's a part of that makes sense to me, just because, again, we're dealing with a holy God, and this is about kind of atonement and reconciliation with a holy God. And so he's like, this particular sacrifice can't be messed up. Like, again, what you do voluntarily and what you offer to me can be your best, and I hope it's your best, but like, don't mess this up, because if you're going to present to a holy God, you need to present a holy offering.
And I was going to say, in the weight of like for example, if they had eaten the offering on the third day, how now this person's sins wouldn't even be reconciled. Like, again, there's that weight of like, if you don't do things in decency and order, not only is this something that is going to affect you, but it's affecting the person that originally these reformations were made for.
Exactly.
So I definitely saw that, and they might have mentioned it in the previous chapters too, and we probably just didn't touch bases on it, but I see God really establishing like what's clean and what's unclean.
That part, I didn't see it earlier.
So honestly, it must have been because in chapter 7, I think in verse 21 is when I saw some things about being unclean and clean, and then we'll continue to probably see it on in the further chapters. But yeah, like, we're starting to get a glimpse of like, okay, what does God consider clean and not clean?
Yeah, we have a whole section of that a few chapters later that really kind of speak to that. But that's good. It's good to see that that's kind of appeared here. Anything else kind of here in 7? As far as like what the priest needed to do specifically before we kind of get to the ordination.
Were you gonna say something?
Good.
No, I was just gonna say I will say that like in verse 27, you start seeing like as well, like when certain things are done, that people are to be cut off, and it sounds like a very like that's a big thing to basically shun someone away. But again, I think it just shows the significance and magnitude of like God saying like, no, this is serious. Like, I want you guys to be holy, and don't even associate yourself with things that aren't holy, because you are the chosen people. I do want you guys to be set apart. Therefore, that person as a result needs to be separated from my holy people. So there's just a lot of weight like with a lot of these things that we'll see, is that you're not just about to get away with it and just, there's consequences, like real consequences that comes with all of this.
Yeah, I think that's like part of like the first little snippet that we see, because he's giving all these rules, explaining all these things, and now here we get a little snippet of like, but if you don't do it right, consequence, right? And he said he expands upon it later on. But yeah, I noticed that too. And then it happens right before God transitions from speaking to the priest back to speaking to the people, and is giving them some more like do's and don'ts here, like how you should bring this offering, and what piece you should eat and what piece you shouldn't eat, and what piece you should give. And so, like I said, I just feel like he just went into like another layer of like, oh yeah, here's some more instruction on what I've already talked to you about.
Yeah, I think you called this out a little bit yesterday, but again, with the context of all of this, is keeping in mind that God is trying to establish a people and teach them what it means to be holy. And I think you use this example or illustration of like a small child, right, where there's extra rules, right? Like, technically walking close to the edge of a pool is not dangerous for most adults, right? But for a child, like, you don't let them walk close to the edge of the pool because you expect them to, they might slip up or they might fall in. They may not be careful enough, right? So that rule seems a little over, just too much maybe for an adult, but for a child, like, that's a reasonable rule. And it's like God is kind of doing that with his people, where he's trying to say, I need you guys to go through all of this so that you can understand what it means to be in a relationship with a holy God. And I think, like, for me, it's really challenging, because obviously we don't have to go through the same steps or like methods for a relationship. Jesus kind of solves a lot of this, of what we'll read here in Leviticus, and it kind of sets up ultimately what Jesus has to endure for us. But I do still just wonder, like, am I doing enough to like just consider that like I'm in a relationship with a holy God,
Yeah.
right? Like in that, you know, as much as it may not be required, we talked about it. The first 3 chapters are all voluntary, right? So yes, it may not be mandatory. The guilt and sin offering may have already been paid by Jesus. But what about my voluntary offering to God?
Yeah.
You know, do I offer still myself to him in a way that is holy and acceptable, you know, even as you referred to it, Romans 12 yesterday, right? So, yeah, I think that when I read through this, that's just kind of one of the things, reflections. It's like, man, they went through a lot. We don't have to go through that.
Yeah.
But am I still just kind of uniquely and keenly aware of the relationship I have with a holy God in that way?
And I'm actually glad you said that, because as I was like reading Leviticus, one of the things that I was thinking about is that a lot of this stuff in the context of it, and really all of it, is God giving these instructions to the Israelites while they're away from other people.
Yes.
Like they're not even, he's like prepping them and setting them up to like, once you get to the point where you do go into these different lands or you are encountering other people, I still want you to be distinguished from them.
Yeah.
And so with that being said, I was thinking like all these little steps, like these are the building blocks to bigger things. Like, okay, whenever you are in a community and you start seeing all these different things happening, these pagan worshiping and all this stuff, like how are you going to conduct yourself?
Correct.
Like what are you going to do?
Yeah, when they offer you blood to drink, you know better. You know in that moment. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's like, again, it may seem so tedious and like, oh, this is, you know, like why would he do that? And especially with a lot of it being involving animals, but we're taking baby steps. If we can't even follow instruction with animals, how are you going to act with people that can actually talk back? Like actually, you know, have their own sense of being and their all those things. So that stuck out to me.
Yeah. And I'm glad you guys said that, because even in how God's doing it, just to go back on like instructions like a child, like he tells them just what to do, but he often doesn't describe why quite yet. Just like a parent does with a child. Sometimes, like, I'm not going to explain to my 2-year-old, okay, why. I'm going to tell them, no, don't do it.
Yeah.
And then when they get a little bit more knowledge, right, and can understand, then I might give you a little bit of why. Okay, here's some consequences. This is what I'm trying to get you to do or learn or stay from. And because it's not even until chapter 11 that we see that he's telling them there that, like, okay, I need you to be holy because I am holy.
Yeah.
Like, I am choosing you guys to be a set apart people.
Yeah.
And this is how you're supposed to act and conduct yourself. Because like you said, before you go into this land, know that you are supposed to be holy and that you are mine.
Yeah.
And that I am holy. And if you're if I'm going to go with you, because remember, he said he wasn't going to go with them into this promised land.
Yeah.
He was like, I'm going to send my angel and I'm going to stay back. And then Moses was like, no, we not going if you're not going.
Right.
And so he's like, okay, if I'm going to go with you, you need to know how to live in my presence. Right.
Yeah.
And so he's establishing this, but I don't think it's too far off of what he's even still asking us today.
Yeah,
right? Like,
exactly.
Because in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 15 through 16, is once again, he refers back to this, like, be holy because the Lord is holy. And there's still this call in the New Testament that we are still supposed to act set apart.
Exactly.
We are still supposed to be in the world, not of the world. Like, we're still supposed to have, there's so many examples and instructions that the apostles give us on how to live, and even just how to live as followers of Jesus, that our ways should change. Like, our customs should be different, that we should no longer operate and act like people around us, what we're accustomed to, even how we were raised.
Exactly.
Like, it's becoming a new person for sure. And so I think I don't think that gets lost when Jesus comes, right?
Yeah.
I still think that he still wants us to be a holy, set apart people. But the two things that, interestingly enough for me, that he points out in 1 Peter, that we do this is through obedience to the word of God and love. And so, like, that is like the heart of it, is like, you know, love, it covers a multitude of sins. And so, like, even just looking at, you mentioned it yesterday, like how we're supposed to act with one another. A lot of these rules are trying to cover, like, how to act with each other, have integrity, like, you know, and then how to act with the Lord. Like, a lot of it is love. Like, if we just had that, and if we obey God's word, okay, because they messed up already on the first commandment. All right, like, if we just obey God's word, it'll save us a whole lot of trouble.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes, that is really good.
Victoria. Good. Just kind of for to move ahead a little bit, you kind of referred to 11. We're not quite there yet, but I kind of want to take 8, 9, and 10 together in some ways, right? So 8, we get the ordination of Aaron's sons, kind of as priests. There's kind of this inaugural ministry that starts at 9, and then 10 they kind of mess up already. It didn't take long for their sons to kind of have some issue there. So let's just talk about Aaron's sons and kind of 8, 9, and 10. Some of what you guys thought was interesting. One, as they were ordained, maybe even some of the practice there, but also just kind of their brief rise and fall that we kind of see here.
Yeah, I love how it's like the instruction so far, and now it's the doing.
Yeah,
like now they're actually doing what God has taught them to do.
Yeah. Even the title, like chapter 9, mine says the priests begin their ministry. It's like, okay, now you're stepping into your calling. And again, like it makes you appreciate the chapters before this, because it's like, okay, God gave them the blueprint. Now it's time them to do it and to fulfill it. And with that, like, I'm just going to point out that, I mean, we already seeing in chapter 10, like, literally death of the 2 sons of Aaron because of them not being obedient. And it seemed like it was like so short-lived. Like you just started your ministry, and already like God has showed himself to be true and just to what he says. Like I told you guys, like if you don't do certain stuff a certain way, these are the consequences, and him making a example out of them of like, no, like I'm so holy, y'all, to the point of some things do require death. So yeah,
I agree. I think the reason it's kind of good to even take those together, like I said, is just because, as you're right, they get these instructions, they get to actually put them into practice. But I think, chapter 10, again, we live in a season of grace of the Lord, right? So it feels a little extreme that what seems like a minor mistake here, right? To offer fire before the Lord had commanded them to do it. That it was just like consumed and they died. But I love, verse 3, right? Where, Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord has spoken. I will demonstrate my holiness to those who are near me, and I will reveal my glory before all the people. Like, it was just, God was just like, no, I'm going to remind you clearly and inform you, I am holy. And this is about me. It's not about y'all. Right? And let me be clear on that. And I love it. Aaron just couldn't even say anything. He had no comeback. Like, it was just like he remained silent. Excuse me, because like, it was just clear God was setting the standard very early. Right. And I think I it's something I kind of appreciate, because I have a tendency to, kind of give a little grace and kind of do that. And it's so much harder to get people back to the standard once you've like moved the standard, right? And to enforce that, like even with, our kids, right? It's so much harder to expect them to actually live up to the standard when you've constantly just bended that standard over and over again. And I feel like God is just trying to say early on, like, no, I made it clear what the expectations were. I'm going to hold you to those. And I want to make it known now that we're going to hold you to these kind of from here on out.
And how like in the previous verses in chapter 9, like God had just presented himself and showed himself to the people through fire to the point where like they fell down and they were shouting for joy and they worshiped him in a way. And so I wonder if it was one of those things, like, again, like God is trying to show them that like, no, I am God. Like, you can't manufacture me.
Right.
Like you can't just try to in your own way replicate who I am and do these things out of order.
That's what I was thinking, because it seemed to me it was less about the incense. And I was trying to read my notes in the commentary in my study Bible. But it seemed like it was less about the incense and more about this unauthorized fire. I'm like, well, where did they get this from? Because it said like God just demonstrated himself as fire. And then even as the consequence showed up as fire. And it's kind of like they were supposed to use a certain fire.
Right.
And they didn't. And I think it is very important and so weighty because it was the symbol of God, right? That it was like, you can't go outside of who I am to accomplish what I'm doing here.
Yeah.
Like in this realm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting. But there are so many rules, and like I just didn't understand. Did they have this written down that like they're like, right, step 1,
Right.
take this part. Okay, take this part, sprinkle. You know, like I wonder if they like had to just memorize this, or if they have, because to me, like as a someone who likes to bake and cook, like I have my recipe.
Come on.
Here.
Come on.
Okay, and I'm like double checking. Okay, this goes next, that goes next, and to me, I'm like, well, was it just an accident?
Right.
Like it wasn't just an accident or overlooked. Or did they look at the instructions or remember the instructions correctly? To me, it seems like he said we have chapters and chapters worth right now of instruction.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, while they're in there, like how they are following each and every one of them.
Yeah.
Yep.
Especially since I think you guys had mentioned it before, like they knew the word through someone else reciting it and saying it. So it seemed like they're skilled in a way to like remember and use their memory. But if you are telling me in 2024 to remember,
Honey.
Yeah.
oh, I ain't got it. So yeah.
Yeah, but I think we have enough evidence of who God is to this point to know that it's always a heart posture with him.
Yeah. It
Right?
It is.
Like we have seen time and time again, people make mistakes and he not adjudicate judgment, right? Or have judgment on them. And other times where, again, things have seemed minor, but he has just literally just destroyed them immediately. And it always has come down to someone's heart posture in that moment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And so even though we don't have all of the insight of what, Nadab and Abihu were thinking, it would be my assumption that if God went to this extreme measure, that it's not because they accidentally put the wrong ingredient in their, in their concoction here, right? But that there was some heart posture, where they either tried to summon God in a time in which he didn't want to be summoned, right? Or they were, it was performative in some way, right? For the people, it was something in their heart. And I love, it's interesting. In my study Bible, the comment says that like this holiness was always an example of God just saying like, don't forget, we're not buddy. Like we're not friends.
Yeah.
Right. Like I am a holy God.
Yep.
And I'm not a genie that just shows up at your beckoning, right? And your call, but just kind of reminding the people that, again, I am a holy God. So I say that to say, I just think we have enough, in my opinion, to this point through Genesis and Exodus, have enough evidence to say God didn't just kill for the sake of killing, right? He didn't just do that because, but it was oftentimes a heart issue. And based off our heart posture, it would determine kind of how he viewed it. So, I don't have the evidence to say it was an accident or not, right? We don't have that in scripture. But there's a part of me that feels it's unlikely that they simply just made a mistake because they forgot an instruction, but more so something in their heart, in their reasons behind why they kind of did this unauthorized or presented this unauthorized fire. There's something about that. Last thing I'll say on that is just, I do think it's the difference again between he and the other gods that were known in these pagan lands, because these other gods that were known in pagan lands, they were essentially summoned when there was a need on behalf of the people, right? Like we don't have any rain. Let me go offer a sacrifice to get rain from, whatever God I'm serving. Or, I don't have any babies, so let me go offer a sacrifice because I want a son, right? It was often this summoning of whatever gods and idols that they served. And again, back to part of the point of this is God is also trying to distinguish himself from the gods that they knew, the pagan gods they knew. I think he was just like, hold up, I'm not them. I'm not, this God is going to show up when you tell me to show up, right? And I think there's some of that to it as well.
Yeah. I was going to mention, I think, two things. One was as a result of Aaron's sons dying, how him and his brothers weren't allowed to grieve at that time. Like Moses literally tells them, like, don't let your hair become unkempt, and don't tear your clothes or you will die, and the Lord will be angry with the whole community. But like, as for your relatives, all the Israelites may mourn for those that the Lord has destroyed by fire. And that starts off in verse 6 of chapter 10. And man, I can imagine that being a hard thing to do. Because obviously you feel some type of way towards like seeing your son, and then even for the brothers, like seeing that happen. But also knowing that, like, I think I could understand why Moses also did mention it, though, about the Lord being angry, because we should be angry about the things that angers God. Like, we should, like, have this type of heart of, like, hey, we want righteousness just as much as you. So I can see that being a thing. Yeah.
Because we don't even get to see, like, this rule that priests are not supposed to keep their hair unkept or their clothes torn until like chapter 21. And so I do think he was just like, okay, listen, don't get yourselves killed too. Okay. Like, you're sad, but you have to finish this consecration process. You have to finish these sacrifices. You still have to remain holy in front of this God, because you're still in his presence, right? Like, you're still in his presence. And so if you go outside of his will, like, y'all might get burnt up too. Like let's keep it together. But it is, you say, I couldn't imagine, like, it is hard to know they weren't able to grieve.
And it does seem like it wasn't until this thing happened that God started getting even more detailed about like what they can and cannot do. So it seems like more regulations and just accountability comes up, because even in verse 8 we see like God tell them, don't be drinking wine, like in the tent, like, and then the chapters as we continue on will kind of get more into, like you said, about how as priests, not just the regulations when it comes to handling the food and the sacrifice, but even for you, like what you are to do and not to do, because you are to be holy and set apart as well. So yeah,
I think as you guys are talking, what it says to me is like, I don't like, there's no excuse for unrighteousness in God's eyes, right? Or unholiness. Like, if I were to kind of just, fast forward that again to today, that like, even me grieving over the loss of my brothers is not a reason to go out and wild out, and act a fool and do something that's not of God, right? Or even if I lost my job, or my marriage is on the rocks, or my kids is acting up. Like, none of those are reasons and excuses to be unrighteous and unholy. And I think that's what he's kind of saying, is that for them, again, we don't have to go through all this now, but for them, this was the standard of holiness for them. And it's like, you don't get to be unholy just because someone else was sinful, right, or unrighteous, and they made a mistake. And so I think to me, it kind of just lays the foundation that, like, my expectation is that you are holy no matter what. And so again, might seem a little unfair, and I'm sure they get their opportunity to grieve eventually, but just like in that moment, for the point of holiness and righteousness, you don't get to break character in that just because something happened.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is so relatable. I do feel like the process of grief can cause you to pick up these different things, as far as like voids, or even drinking, like that could be something that you kind of drown yourself into. So like you said, just keeping that mindset of like, this does not allow for this to be okay. It's good because I didn't look at it in that way, but that is good.
And if I might just back up a little bit, I do think that was interesting. That God, not really interesting, but like it makes sense. But that God used Moses to be the one to like consecrate the priest. Like that God, Moses stepped in because God has always said that Moses was going to be like God to Pharaoh and them, right? And he is the voice of God to the people right now. Like that God is using Moses still because like Moses, I don't believe he's going to be the one doing all of this, right? But like he just sets the tone in, because his lineage isn't of the priest, but like he sets the tone of like consecrating them and giving them all the instructions and doing all these ritual things to them in chapter 8. And then even like in chapter 10, when he kind of checks back in with Aaron, is like, well, why didn't you eat this part? Like he's still like there managing and making sure things are happening the way they should be.
For sure.
And so I think that exchange was interesting, that like he is still there watching or inquiring after the fact of like, okay, did you eat this part? Did you do this part? Did this happen? That he is this like overshadowing like manager of such. But I did ponder on Aaron's response when Moses did ask him like, well, why didn't you eat the sin offering? And I wondered if it's because like that was for like the atonement of the sin, but God had already gave judgment. And so he's like, well, if I ate of this, it's not like he would have accepted
That's real.
this sin offering as like an atonement for his life. He already took the lives of my sons. Like, and he's probably playing it safe too. Like, is it even okay for me to eat this sin offering? Because your wrath has already came out once. So like, I'm not even sure if this is acceptable for me to eat because you've already, stepped in. And
that's good. No, I think that's a very good observation.
Yeah, but I think it goes back to even your point earlier about what the Dab and Abihu did. It wasn't like Aaron wasn't clear, right, on the instructions. Like he even asked that question then, like, would if this have even been acceptable? He wasn't particularly clear, but his heart posture was right.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
It's not like he did it exactly as God said. I mean, the fact that Moses asked him goes to show he didn't really follow the instructions exactly as described, right? But as Moses talked it over with Aaron and understood his heart posture, it was acceptable. Yeah. Right? And so I think even going back to it, like that's where, to me, again, there's just this evidence that it's all about our heart, our intent, and our posture there that ultimately God judges. Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna kind of call it audible here. And not do chapter 11 today. It is part of our reading, so definitely read it if you haven't done so. But 11, 12, 13, some of the others, they kind of go together as we deal with some of this like clean and unclean and, what to touch and not to touch and what to do during diseases and all that kind of stuff. So I would like to discuss that together tomorrow, if that's okay with you guys. And so we're actually going to stop here at chapter 10 for the podcast purposes. But again, for your reading, read through chapter 11 just to help you with your pace throughout the week. But we'll come back tomorrow, pick up at chapter 11 and go through a few more there. But yeah, thank you guys for joining us again today, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.
Thank you for joining us for the VIBEZ Daily podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or download our favorite, the VIBEZ Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue our journey through